Good afternoon. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual event this afternoon, co-hosted with the School of Cities on Taking Flight, the role of airports in thriving city regions. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Although this event is virtual, and I realize that everybody listening is in a different place, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the City of Toronto, the region of Halton, and the region of York. I would also like to thank our team at IMFG for putting this event together today, Nevena Dragicevic and Piali Roy. And I would also like to thank the events and technical staff of the Munk School, Adam Bell and Daria Dumbadze. If you're tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. So today we're going to be talking about airports. Airports are hubs of mobility, employment, and the movement of goods. They are critical drivers of prosperity and growth for their regions, as well as the country as a whole. The COVID-19 pandemic and our efforts to restrict the spread of the virus have dramatically reduced international travel, as you well know, by up to 90% compared to pre-pandemic levels. The decline in travel has had an enormous and far-reaching impact for society and the economy, and in particular for the regions in which airports operate. And it's caused a little blip at the IMFG as well, because we were really supposed to hold this event in March 2020 and had all our speakers lined up and had to postpone it until this year. With the province of mass vaccination and a return to some semblance of normal on the horizon, today's event provides a timely opportunity to explore the future of airports and their role in successful city regions. And as we'll hear, much of that success will rely on how we approach issues of planning and governance. So in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Maddie Smiatycki, who is going to be our moderator. He's going to say a few words. This will be followed by a presentation from Jean-Paul Eddy, who is joining us from Georgia State University. We'll then bring in three panelists, Lloyd McComb, Pamela Blay, and Josh Neubauer, for a discussion with our moderator, and then we'll have audience Q&A. You may ask questions at any time during the presentations using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So I'm going to now turn it over to Maddie Smiatycki, and just briefly to tell you, Maddie is the Canada Research Chair in Infrastructure Planning and Finance and the Interim Director of the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. Maddie, over to you.
Thank you, Enid. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you to speak about this current moment that we find ourselves in with regards to airports and the role of airports in successful regions. Now, as Enid mentioned, this talk and this panel was originally scheduled for just around this time last year. And suffice to say, if we were to have had this conversation a year ago before the full weight of the pandemic became clear, it would have been a very different conversation. Airports are hugely significant parts of our region. They facilitate global trade, they facilitate international recreation and tourism. And on the land side, as well as in the air, they are major points for employment and employment growth. And so the conversation that would have taken place last year would have really been around managing growth and how we understand airports as they push to move ever more passengers. And we would have situated that within the context of some of the crises that were certainly on the horizon and very well known, particularly related to climate change. The moment now, a year on, gives us clearly a different terrain to tackle, a terrain that is in many ways framed around crisis. Crisis, clearly the biggest ones for airports in our urban regions is the pandemic, and is a public health crisis, which air travel and airports have played somewhat of a role in. When we think about people moving across borders and the spread of invisible viruses. So air travel has been one feature of discussion around the pandemic, but it's also brought into clear focus the other crises that we're facing, crises around climate change and forcing us to think about what that's going to mean in the future. If the pandemic has caused this type of upheaval, what is going to happen if we have a generational crisis and an ongoing crisis around climate change? Additionally, matters of systemic racism burst into everyone's consciousness more than they had been in the past, and have required us to think through what it means to be in societies that are deeply unequal. And for airports then, what does this mean for travel, for the tourism industry, for the people that work in airports, for the people that service airports, and all of the infrastructure related to airports and the businesses and communities that surround airports. Then we have matters of trade and trade tensions, which are starting to bubble globally between countries. And so all of these matters then, in some ways, find a focal point in airports and in the type of air travel that they facilitate. And so today's discussion, I think it's a really important moment actually to reconvene, to think through what is the future of airports within a thriving region. And we're very fortunate to have a great group to discuss these matters. And we will start today, to give you just a quick run of show, we'll start today with Jean-Paul Adi, who's an assistant professor in urban studies at Georgia State University. And he's a geographer who works on issues of urban and regional governance with a focus on politics of infrastructure, and has been doing work on airports in particular. And we will then move into a panel discussion with Lloyd McCombs, Pamela Bley, and Josh Neubauer, and we'll get into some of the details and unpack some of the material in Jean-Paul's presentation. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for some audience Q&A, which we'll be taking from the Q&A feature in Zoom. So you can write your Q&A there, and I'll moderate that discussion. So with that, we will get started. So Jean-Paul Adi, as I mentioned, is assistant professor in urban studies at the Urban Studies Institute at Georgia State University. He's an urban geographer. His work focuses on regional governance, and his work really focuses on questions of city regionalism, which I think is central to how we understand the mandate of airports and how they fit into larger urban regions. So to get us started, Jean-Paul, the floor is yours, and then after Jean-Paul's presentation, we will move into a panel discussion. Jean-Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maddie, and thank you, Enid and the IMFG, for the invitation to come and talk to you virtually about a crucial set of issues at a critical juncture. Of course, I'd love to have had the opportunity to be in Toronto with you, but first, we've got to turn to the reason why I'm welcoming you to the spare room in my home in Atlanta rather than joining you in Toronto, which is this guy who I'm sure we're all more than familiar with at the moment. This is COVID-19. Air infrastructure, the topic at hand today, has really been central to the current pandemic. So COVID, just as SARS before it, has really demonstrated that pathogens move rapidly through global cities, global city networks, through the infrastructures of globalization, chief among them air transportation, air travel networks. And so we face some really interesting paradoxical challenges at the moment when infectious disease is carried by the same infrastructures that move the people, resources, goods that enable global city regions to thrive and support everyday life in a globalized urban world. So the COVID-19 pandemic has really kind of presented a major threat to air travel, to airports, and to the aviation industry, perhaps more so than the oil crises of the 70s, SARS, September 11th, the Great Recession of 2008-9, and ash clouds erupting from Iceland. None of these previous crises has hit home to the extent that the COVID pandemic has for thinking about airlines and the aviation industry. So with many travel restrictions still in place, quarantine rules limiting travel, gleaming international airports from Toronto to Hong Kong, Atlanta to Dubai, once the epicenter of global connectivity, are operating well under capacity. And we have tens of thousands of aircrafts being stored in hangars or in deserts indefinitely during the continued kind of impacts of the pandemic. So the International Air Transportation Association has predicted that industry revenues are going to fall, or would have fallen by $419 billion over the course of 2020. And this is precisely half of what the airlines earned in 2019. So for example, American Airlines posted a net loss for 2020 of $8.9 billion, Delta $5.7 billion, Southwest $3.1 billion. We can see the impacts here too in hitting Canadian airports, which are predicted to face $2.2 billion deficits as a result of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the important things here is to realize that these aren't just, these are big monumental figures, unprecedented figures, but they're not just abstract numbers, and they reflect real impacts on people's lives and livelihoods. So COVID-19 has levied a human cost on what geographer Wee Kwai Nin terms the underbelly of low-skilled workers in the aviation industry. So not just frontline staff like flight and cabin crews, but also armies of caterers, launderers, drivers, ramp service operators who toil behind the scenes, and many of whom have either been furloughed or have lost their jobs as a consequence of the pandemic. So COVID-19 hasn't just hit airports and airports industries through these kind of large economic numbers, but it has consequences for the social and economic fortunes of cities, regions, and their inhabitants, so the people who are working at the airports themselves. So as urbanists, Teresa Enright from the University of Toronto and Kevin Ward have argued, if we want to understand the imprint of the pandemic on cities and the means through which they're going to be rebuilt in post-pandemic times, we really have to think about putting infrastructure at the center of the conversation. Now, this isn't thinking about post-pandemic futures from a position of centrality, thinking about the global city. There are different kind of geographies that we need to be aware of. So the importance of auto manufacturing networks between Wuhan and Bavaria, for example, have been fundamental in the spread of COVID-19 through the edges and the suburban fringes of metropolitan regions. So not necessarily thinking about the core of global cities, but it's these peripheral areas where airports are really embedded that we need to kind of think about. And this is significant because airports are often located on the edges of urban areas, and they present complex governance and jurisdictional challenges. And this has become really apparent when we're looking about who has the responsibility to control disease outbreaks in large urban areas. So the COVID-19 pandemic, the spread of the coronavirus, has clearly restated the importance of thinking about coordinated governance responses between levels of government at key spaces like airports. So in China, multi-level governance proved to be breaking down at the outset of the pandemic as local, regional, and central authorities weren't sufficiently coordinated at the beginning of the crisis. And this is something which Roger Kyle, Creighton Connolly, and Harris Ali have argued parallels the intergovernmental confusion in Canada during the 2003 SARS outbreak. So we're seeing a crisis of governance emerging here. So as Enright and Ward have put it, quote, the uneven nature of the COVID-19 pandemic is in part due to variations in these governance arrangements, so institutional, legal, and regulatory contexts that we can think of as the governance of infrastructure. But at the same time, the uneven nature of the pandemic also emerges because of the unevenness of infrastructure networks themselves, the ways in which air network connectivity is articulated at a global scale. And this we can think of in terms of governance by infrastructure. So we have an interesting kind of twofold dynamic here. Questions of governance, I want to suggest, are therefore at the crux of the current moment, and the challenges and opportunities airports present city regions like Toronto, Atlanta, and elsewhere moving forward. So I'd like to return to these questions of governance shortly, but before I do that, I want to take a step back and contextualize how some of these dynamics have unfolded in relation to how in pre-pandemic days, if we can remember that far back, airports have been framed as urban infrastructures and urban actors. So airports have always had a strong connection to notions of economic development. So let me take you here to 1931, where the Toronto Industrial Commission argued that air travel placed Toronto in a strategic central location in relation to the northeast section of North America. So in the 30s, 13 of the 20 largest urban areas in North America could be reached by air within a 5-hour flight from Toronto, even though the city's air infrastructure at the time consisted of 5 grass strips. And we can compare this to Montreal and Vancouver, who at the time boasted luxurious modern paved amenities that Toronto was lacking. So the little black dot here, which we can suggest here, might be a Moulton Airport, which became Toronto International Airport and eventually Pearson, wouldn't take off until the post-war period as a center of aviation and development in the Toronto region, particularly following the sale of the airport from the municipality of Toronto to the federal government in 1958. So modernization programs here coordinated between the federal government and the province in the 60s and 70s established regional connections for the airports across southern Ontario, tying it to downtown through the 401, through the Gardiner Expressway. But with these autocentric links in place, local planning and transit connections and engagement with the airport remained pretty weak. And one of the ways that this is put to me by an airport manager I interviewed once, I think this is a nice analogy, is that during the time up until 1996, when Pearson was controlled by the federal government, it was, quote, almost like the airport was a black hole. Municipalities were doing their own thing all around it. But when it came to the airport boundaries, everything stopped and there was little integration. So in a sense, Pearson was in, but not of the Toronto region. Like a black hole, it exerted a tremendous influence on the areas surrounding it with its gravitational pull structuring developments in the Greater Toronto area, but in a way that was marshaled at alternative scales of government. So the situation began to change following deregulation of national aviation systems, first in the United States in 1978 and Canada in 1987, where in conjunction with continental free trade agreements, barriers to entry for aviation were lowered and exposed airports and cities to intense interlocality competition, which placed pressure on key continental centers to develop and expand their air capacity. Now, as airports have changed over time, I think this post-deregulation instance being particularly important, land use patterns around airports have also changed. So here, there's some representations here from the work of Andy Getz. It captures how from the 1900s to the 1960s, airports really existed as a simple extended outpost in the city, where low order, low density activities like parking, service stations, rental cars were lightly clustered around the airports on the outskirts, the periphery of an urban center. Into the 1960s and through to the 80s, the role shifted and we see airports emerging as diversified outer nodes with more middle order, but still low density activities clustering around them, like office complexes, industrial parks, conference rooms and hotels and restaurants. More recently, following the 80s, but particularly taking off in the 21st century, we see claims now that airports are new centers in large urban regions, that they are almost eclipsing the traditional central business district in terms of economic importance. So we have the reframing of airports in material and discursive terms as global metropolitan centers with high order, medium density activities like corporate headquarters, producer services, mixed use activities emerging up around them. So in a sense, what we're tracing here, what Gertz is illustrating is a shift from the city airport to the development of the airport city. And the airport city idea was really initially first embraced. The classic example here is Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport City, where urban functions are pushed onto airport land. And we see a breaking down of the distinction between urban region and the airport itself. And there's numerous examples of this kind of growing around the world, but it's something which has become really a policy framework, a bundle, an idea of urban development for many regions, from envisioning the future development of Manchester to Hyderabad in India, HIA Airport in Doha. We see a global kind of embrace of this airport-led development, this airport city logic. But as airport-centered functions have come onto the airport land itself in the form of airport cities, we also see the impact of aviation tide economic activity percolating out beyond the boundaries of the airport itself. So here we can see the transition from the airport city idea to the notion of what John Quesada and colleagues have termed the aerotropolis. And this quite is an extended airport integrated region reaching as far as 60 miles from its inner cluster of hotels, offices, distribution, and logistics facilities. So the airport itself becomes framed as this hub of new economy functions and activities which bolster a city's competitiveness, job creation, and quality of life. So there's an important idea here that's being framed initially as an empirical phenomena that Quesada was documenting, but it's something which has slipped into a form of planning and policy advocacy. So the aerotropolis isn't just an empirical thing which we're observing in the world, but it's a policy and development framework which has traveled the world with figureheads like Quesada arguing that the aerotropolis is, to quote the subheading of their book, the way that we'll live next. This is the future of 21st century urbanization. This is a book that came out in 2011. So really driven by strong narratives regarding the economic impact of airports on urban, regional, national economies, the aerotropolis idea has really kind of taken off. So researchers established that economies that are increasingly based in human and information services are linked to a rapid growth in air travel. Studies of airports' economic impacts by Button and Yuan, for example, have argued that investment in air transportation infrastructure stimulates economic growth rather than the other way around. So the more passenger boardings an airport has, you can say the greater the population and economic growth of the city. And the same relationship holds for freight, where increased air cargo has a stronger positive effect on regional employment than the reverse. So framed in this light, airport and airport-focused development are among the most important regional tasks that global city regions have, even as they're contested forms of planning and development. So we see normative assumptions here regarding airports' economic impacts being substantially codified through quantitative metrics and persistent yet unquestioned tropes around global competitiveness. What's missing, though, in some of these arguments is a discussion of how economic and urban development agendas hit the ground relative to both vertical and horizontal hierarchical forms of governance that come into play around airports and city regional contexts. If we want to address the central question of the discussion today, so what role do airports play in ensuring thriving and prosperous city regions, we need to think about unpacking some of these governance, political planning questions. So normative arguments regarding the role of airports as economic engines, as drivers of growth abound. And here's just a representative sample from Richard Florida from 2018, arguing that he's traditionally focused on high-tech industries, the creative class as drivers of global economic competitiveness, but has recently started to think about the role of airports in shaping economic development. So we have the idea that the airport is really becoming a challenge to the central business district in terms of economic activity and employment generation. So Appold and John Quesada, writing in 2013, looked to kind of demonstrate this relationship and stress the importance of airports as employment hubs. And they compared the number of jobs within a certain distance from airports and the central business districts of 25 US cities, and found that employment within 2.5 miles of the airport in the sample sites was 50.6% as large as within 2.5 miles from the city center, suggesting that airports were becoming new focal points of development in US metropolitan areas. Now, transportation geographer Julie Siddell in 2015 challenged this study and conducted a similar analysis using the airport as well as the region's largest shopping mall, its largest wastewater treatment facility, that's the picture on the right here, and a kind of random point in the opposite direction of the CBD from the airport. And Siddell found that in just over half the cases, there were more jobs created in 2.5 miles of the wastewater facility treatment plant than the airport in the cities that she looked at. And the random point in the opposite direction of the central business district from the airport was more or less equivalent to the airport in terms of number of jobs within that 2.5 mile radius. Now, this is a relatively an oversimplified way of thinking about how we analyze the complex processes and phenomena here, but it does go to problematize some of the more boosterish arguments that are being made around the economic contribution that airports are making in their emergence as employment and economic hubs. And this is something which is significant given the traction that aerotropolis type arguments have had in planning and policy discourse in a number of local and national contexts. So studies of airport economic benefits, one of the things which is an issue here is that they're primarily framed at the regional or metropolitan scale, and they're tended to ignore the individual histories and morphologies of metropolitan areas, and to a certain degree overstate the influence that the airport has on economic development in their regions. Now, if we shift our scalar imaginary and look at the scale of the airport and its immediate vicinity, there's a lot less consensus in terms of what benefits airports bring in terms of economic development and how they offset harms caused by negative externalities from the airport. So meta-studies of economic impacts in the US and Europe suggest that the immediate environs surrounding an airport may actually experience detrimental economic effects due to labor competition, noise, traffic congestion, and so on. So one of the things here, if we kind of render more complex the scalar dynamics that are happening, is the tensions here between airports as major nodes of worldwide connectivity and centers of local land use and planning transportation networks. So they generate, on one hand, territories of economic activity and employment, but they also create social geographies, social territories within city regions that, on one hand, we can think about negative aspects of airports, aviation activity, leading to NIMBY groups that protest potential airport expansion. So the ideas that coalesce around anti-airport activities from Chicago to London. Whenever talk of airport expansion comes up, you can see certain political solidarities being brought into being. But we can also think about the development of hyper-localized growth coalitions looking to access and tap into those benefits that the aerotropolis model puts forward. So my own research kind of demonstrates that in contrast to the aerotropolis itself, actually existing aero-regionalism catalyzes geographically uneven development, localized environmental impacts, which invoke kind of a complex and contested politics surrounding airport infrastructure. So if we want to ask what is the impact of airports on city regions, we need to break down and think of the heterogeneous spaces and communities within city regions themselves. So this argument, it reflects an immediate kind of normative truth, but a persistent, challenging political problematic. So the airport extends beyond its built form, drawing together a whole bunch of social and technical systems into an organism of the urban economy. But as an organism of the urban economy, airports scale beyond city life. So clearly we need to think about governance questions, planning questions beyond the city itself. We need to reframe and rescale how we think about these conversations. Because airports are contested, contradictory spaces. They're material infrastructures. So we can think about terminals, runways. Work of Evan McDonough, for example, has kind of highlighted the role of flight path alignments and the need to think about the city region as a three-dimensional space if we're thinking about planning and understanding the impact of airports. Airports are also nodes of governance, from national air frameworks to airport management to local and municipal and regional forms of planning, which coalesce and assemble around airport space. And thirdly, airports are also symbolic. They're symbolic spaces that project cities and regions into broader global networks. So the point of entry of immigrants, tourists, the people who make places like Toronto exciting, dynamic, multicultural environments. So this implies a number of things. Firstly, the need for interdisciplinary perspectives. If we're thinking about airports, we can't just rely on economic metrics, quantification, notions of airport management or engineered smart solutions to airport planning on and off the airport site. We need to think about balancing the impacts and imaginaries of airports at different scales and asking questions around how actors in city regions think about their airports in political and economic terms, and who has the capacity to leverage their impacts and shape the development trajectories of city regional spaces surrounding airports. Now, this is important because on one hand, regions build infrastructure. They build the points of interface and connectivity with airport sites. And they integrate regional space in and around these kind of global hubs of global connectivity. So here we can think about questions of contextual planning surrounding regional mobility and how these things might integrate city regional space and airports in more equitable and efficient ways. So this, whether we can think about Union Station West at Pearson, as captured in this image, or debates around opening Western Access O'Hare airports. Stakeholders are interested in breaking through the event horizon of airport development to connect what goes on at airports physically, infrastructurally, with visions and plans for the future development of urban regions. And one of the important things in the city regional context here is the need to look away from a binary connection between linking the airport and the central business district. So we're here thinking about city regional airports rather than city airports. And here it's worth quoting Brampton Mayor Linda Jeffrey, who says in relation to the new transportation multimodal hub at Pearson that, quote, location matters, and Toronto Pearson's close proximity to Brampton gives us a definitive advantage when it comes to attracting global companies to our city. A major multimodal transit center serving the Western GTA located at our airport will provide a critical connection between Brampton and the rest of the world. So in this quote, there's a couple of interesting things going on. There's a stress regarding physical connectivity, but there's also a question regarding discursive ownership of the airport, stressing that Brampton is Pearson is Brampton's airport as much as is Toronto or any other municipality in the GTAs. So access to the airport becomes vital in planning terms, but we need to think about the rhythms and scales of mobility which are puncturing this event horizon, which also kind of opens questions of transportation, but also issues of affordable housing, getting workers who live close to the airport to have access to these employment centers, while grappling with and balancing issues of environmental and mobility justice. So on one hand, we see the regions building the infrastructure that are connecting airports and city regional space. But secondly, in political terms, we can think about infrastructures serving to build regions or being axes around which regional space city regions are being produced and maintained. So in this instance, we can pose the question, can airports assume the role of a uniting rather than dividing force in city regional landscapes? So here I'm going to briefly take you to Atlanta to have a look at the mobilization of the Aerotropolis model, not just as an expression of airport-led urban development, but as a political project, which on the top left-hand here, the top left-hand image, we can see a sense of the political fragmentation around Hartsfield International Airport in Atlanta, the world's busiest and most efficient airport. There's a whole load of actors here, municipalities, it's in multiple counties, and there's traditionally been a lot of competition surrounding what happens with airport-related activities, either vigorously opposing airport expansion or clamoring in a one-upmanship way to attract the latest hotel or conference center that the airport's kind of pushing for development around the airports. Now, one of the things which is interesting about the Atlanta Aerotropolis experience is that we have this kind of traditional fractured, fragmented political environment. But what brought these actors together was the prospect of Porsche looking to move their North American headquarters from northern suburban Sandy Springs to the north of Atlanta to a site adjacent to the airport. And they didn't want to do that. They weren't going to go and invest this $80 to $100 million in this move without or embedding their new headquarters in this fractured political landscape. So working with the Atlanta Regional Coalition, driven by Porsche, driven by private investment, this is what it took the stakeholders kind of illustrated here on the right-hand side, forced them to come around the table and stop bickering over immediate kind of interlocal competition for investment for hotels and conference centers. It was the threat of Porsche, or the opportunity of Porsche, but also the threat of Porsche not coming down, which brought a diverse number of stakeholders together around a relatively cohesive development vision for what's going on around the airports. So there's logistics and corporate activity happening in and around the vicinity of the airport, but we have actors buying into a singular imagery, not fighting each other, and in a sense, producing a regional space around the airport which didn't exist before. And in the context of Atlanta, this is very unusual. One of the challenges here, so we have this regional space coming together, but we also need to kind of note and flag that there are implications of uneven development. So this slide is just to quickly illustrate that the lower paying logistics jobs it's going to expose residents to more negative externalities of air pollution, traffic congestion in the south region of the airport, in spaces which have been traditionally poor working class communities of color. So to Matty's point about how the racial dynamics play in here, Atlanta, you can't talk about Atlanta development without having race being at the forefront of the conversation. So this still kind of provokes problematic things which we need to work through, both in terms of questions of housing and transportation, but also issues surrounding education and workforce development to access the type of high-end jobs which the Aerotropolis model is looking to promote. I'm going to skip over the next slide in the interest of time to give you some food for thought before we go over to our panelists. And hopefully this will be something which is more palatable than your average airport meal. So thinking about the future of airports in thriving city regional contexts, I want to leave you with kind of 3 provocations before we open up to the panel for discussion. The first is that airports give us the chance to think about regional planning and governance questions in new and interesting ways. In a sense, we can see the region from the outside in, and a region that's very different from downtown compared to sitting in an air traffic control tower in an airport. But with this, airport development and an airport-centered approach to regionalism invokes its own politics. But this often transcends issues surrounding the airport and the immediate airport zone itself. So the bucolic field, which I've taken you to here, is the site of the long-planned second airport for the Greater Toronto Area, the Pickering Airport. So out into the northeast, this is the site of a phantom infrastructure, never built, kind of postponed in the mid-1970s, but a space where the idea and the image of an airport kind of lingers over the development trajectories of the Greater Toronto Area. So when Pickering gets brought up or questions of airport expansion come up, oftentimes we think about these as surrogate conversations for different types of political bargaining that are happening. Second thing that I want to kind of throw out before we go to the panel is the idea that airports-led development isn't itself an urban economic panacea. Despite their tremendous economic impact and potential to drive growth, airports remain vulnerable to persistent crises, from infectious disease to terrorism to fuel crises. So we need to think about planning and resilience across a number of different registers here. We need to plan for the next crises at the intersection of the airport, its connection to its local and regional context, but also the broader dynamics. And one thing which kind of COVID has brought to the fore is the importance of thinking about the future of work. The fact that we are having this conversation virtually rather than in person is potentially telling about the future dynamics which we need to be thinking about. So while we need to see how the pandemic is going to pan out, the chances are, though, that the hefty investments in air infrastructure and aircraft from the past are going to keep this industry moving against all odds. We're probably going to see a bounce back because of the capital invested in the industry itself. We have significant segments of the global workforce, estimates of some 65.5 million people, in jobs that aren't currently equipped to transition out of airport-dependent jobs. And in fact, we're already starting to see some signs of rejuvenation in air travel at the end of 2020, albeit with some new characteristics kind of thrown in, and Wei Kwin Lin is particularly interesting on this point. So John Casada himself of Aerotropolis fame has stressed that while airport-linked development in most regions will be stymied, at least in the short term, by the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and the subsequent global economic downturn, he suggests that resolutions to COVID and the economic downturn will occur with a worldwide air passenger and cargo volumes rebounding to new heights moving forward. So we have a faith that not only are we going to return to normal, but we're going to continue on the upward trajectory that I think Matty had alluded to at the outset. So there's a risk then here that in our desire to return to life as normal, we may miss an opportunity to think through and embrace the more necessary and radical alternatives to airport-led development. So with this, climate change and the ecological limits of aviation present significant challenges to growth, but also an existential challenge to life on our planet. So the rapid deceleration of the aviation industry in recent weeks has made it very clear that different forms of sustainability and mobility and immobility are going to be necessary, but plugged into broader questions around workforce training and so on and so forth. So as we look at the current ecological limits of growth, climate change, the current crisis, as disruptive as these are, it should give us pause to consider that other flight paths are possible. And with that provocation, I'll turn things over to Matty and the panel. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. If we were in person, you would hear us all clapping. Thank you. Really, yeah, very provocative talk, getting us thinking about what is possible and what is the future flight path. What I want to do now is open up for a panel discussion now amongst some leading thinkers on airports in our region and globally, to try to reflect on some of the themes that Jean-Paul has brought forward in his initial talk. Joining us today are Lloyd McComb, who is President and CEO of the Greater Toronto Airport Authority, and Lloyd is currently the chair of the advisory panel of the University of Toronto's Transportation Research Institute. Pamela Blais is a leading urban planner and principal of Metropole Consultants, which is a Toronto-based planning practice. And Josh Neubauer is principal at Urban Strategies with a key role in their airport planning practice. So these are three leading thinkers to join Jean-Paul and myself to talk about the future of airports, both in this region and with global implications. So to get us started, I want to reflect first on the provocations at the end of Jean-Paul's talk, really about which direction this panel sees the future of air travel and airports. I mean, with the pandemic and these other intersecting crises, do you envision that the airport and air travel and airports are going to essentially bounce back to the trajectory they were on before? Or do you feel like the pandemic has sparked such a significant rethinking, reshuffling of the business of airlines and airports that plus the climate change, that we're going to start seeing a new approach related to airports? So really, this is the question, to boil it right down, is are we going back to the old normal, or are we on a flight path for something new? Lloyd, I'll start with you and then I'll go to the other panelists.
Certainly. Well, I think, let me break it down into two parts. First, talk about business air travel, non-discretionary air travel. I think that certainly COVID is going to result in a very significant change in that, and possibly a permanent change in the sense of what we're doing here, having a video conference in where we would have traveled before to do this. And I think the big change there is that COVID has forced people to overcome their inertia with regard to video conferencing and other substitutes for air travel. And they've gotten comfortable with it. The products have gotten better. And so I think we're going to see a substantial change in business air travel. And that's going to be a reduction, possibly, as I say, permanent. On the other side, on traveling, discretionary travel for visiting friends and relations, vacations and so on, I think the likely situation is initially there's going to be, quite frankly, a surge in demand because there's a lot of pent-up demand. People have not been able to spend money. They're anxious to get out there. The challenge will be, can the industry respond fast enough, in fact, with all these parked planes and furloughed pilots and so on. that's the short term. In the medium term, I think even discretionary air travel has some challenges because, as Jean Paul mentioned, the industry has been forced to accept huge debt to bridge over this period. And that's going to have to be recovered at some point. And that means that ticket prices are going to have to go up. And quite frankly, a lot of particularly the legacy carriers, were very dependent on business air travel to supplement their profit margins. And with that sector much weakened, you're going to see ticket prices go up. And unless things have changed, my long experience was that discretionary air travel is very price elastic. And so in the medium to long term, I think it's going to be a real challenge to get back to where we were. We will. I mean, the drivers are there. The growth will resume, but this isn't going to be a rapid spring back. This is, I guess I shouldn't be forecasting here because all our historical forecasting models have been blown apart by COVID. But I would think optimistically 2024, pessimistically 2027, 28 to get back to 2019 levels.
Thank you. And Pamela, let me go to you now. And I guess in asking you a similar question, I'm wondering about your views on not just air travel itself, but the planning of airports. I mean, pre-pandemic, we were spending a lot of time thinking about, how this growth curve and a lot of energy around how we serve them with ground transportation and how we enable development to take place for light industry, warehousing and other activities. So do you think we continue on that trajectory post-pandemic, or do you think now the pandemic and the idea that a shock can be so significant that it shuts down air travel essentially for a period really has forced us to rethink not just the air travel part, but also what happens on the ground?
Right. Well, I actually think in terms of the air travel itself and its impacts, for the area around the airport, which is really what my interest is the 300,000 jobs that exist in the airport and the area around. I think with respect to the pandemic, actually that aside from the airport itself, the area has actually weathered it quite well because a lot of those things are related to cargo, and cargo I don't think has been so impacted. So, aside from the hotel strip, for example, and employment at the airport itself, which is about 50,000 jobs of the 310,000 jobs in the area as a whole, I think it's been less impacted than one might think. But I guess what's of interest to me is kind of what happens next. And in terms of the pandemic, I think everybody agrees that the main impact it's had is to reveal things that need to change that were kind of below the surface before or not prioritized. And I think with respect to the airport, it really brings out the need to talk about equity, resilience, and getting the most out of those public investments, and really rethinking our priorities. And just to give one example, I think it was mentioned already, the idea of Union Station West, which is, for those who don't know, a planned major transit hub located at the airport. It's supposed to be the gateway now, the transit gateway to Western GTA. It would link with Malton Go, would potentially link with the Finch LRT, potentially link with the Eglinton West LRT, potentially with the Mississauga BRT. So all of these points kind of coming in and focusing on the airport itself. But I think, and it gets to some of the themes I think that Jean Paul was talking about. It's really focused on the access to the airport for travelers. But travelers are really only a very small percentage of the total amount of travel in the area. For example, it focuses on bringing people primarily from the Toronto side, but when you look at where the people who work in that area actually live, most of the people come from the south, and then the next most important source is from the west. So it's not really, it's focused more on serving the kind of the passenger travel rather than serving the broader area, which really is extremely lacking in transit. It's got poor service, it's fragmented, and 94% of the trips to that area are by auto. So it just gives you a sense of how underserved it is. And a lot of those are lower skilled jobs, lower paid jobs. So there's a real equity issue here. And I think we need to kind of start to reframe, as a result of the pandemic, a lot of these questions and think about reprioritizing. What is it that we're trying to achieve here with these kinds of investments in the airport? And it at a sort of higher level, I think it goes to this idea of, we've had this idea of the global competitive city. That's been our mantra for the last 30 years. And that's really been number one thing that's driving our investments. And that's the number one thing that's driving the kind of investment that we're talking about in the Union Station West. But I think we really need to start to talk about, is there some alternative to that? Maybe we should be focusing more on the foundational economy, and the number one priority being getting those people to jobs and improving their quality of life and the environment in which those jobs are located, which is not great.
Thanks, Pamela. And Josh, which direction do you see air travel going and air planning? I mean, are we going back to the old normal, or is there a new path ahead?
I think if you think specifically about our region, and using Pearson as obviously the elephant in the region, I think travel is somewhat baked in to Ontario and certainly to Canada, in a way that maybe other places it would be less so. I mean, 85% of our population growth is from immigration in Ontario. We're now, the government's planning on immigration rates that we haven't seen since the early 1910s, so 400,000 immigrants a year. So I don't know how much we can stop traveling by air, but I take Lloyd's points really well, and he certainly knows more about this than I would, but I can imagine there being a slowing of air travel for business, but I still think demand will continue to rise, but maybe less quickly. And I don't say that as someone, I don't say that I think it should. I just think that may be the way our country works, to be perfectly honest. And I certainly think the pent-up demand for travel is going to continue. On the other side, about the way it's planned, I think I really enjoyed the phrase of the airport event horizon that Jean-Paul put out there, and thinking about that and building on what Pamela said, is we're now thinking about airports as much more than, somewhere where you almost parachute into, whether it's from your taxi ride or what other way you get there, that there's now an edge to the airport that needs to be better integrated into the area. And certainly there's been a lot of buy-in all over the world for the idea of airport cities and the Aerotropolis to maybe a lesser extent. But I think Pearson actually, in particular, is really well set up for that. And I think the Union Station West has the potential to be part of that. And I wear my bias on my sleeve here, given that I've been involved in the consulting on that. So just to be really clear, but we see the same thing happening with things that aren't airports in the GTA. Every shopping mall is now being reevaluated to turn outwards towards the city that it's in, to make better, highest, and best use of its land. And I think we'll see the same thing with airports. Land is incredibly valuable. People are frustrated by unsustainable places that are disconnected from the regions they're in. And people, quite frankly, simply expect transit connectivity. And that's something we heard when we spoke to people across the region about the potential benefits of Union Station West, from Waterloo to Durham. Everyone said that people, when they come to Canada and go to their regions, were always shocked when they got out at Pearson and didn't have regional transit connectivity to the other parts of the region. They simply expect it. And it's sort of baffling that we don't have that. So I just think the way our region has evolved and is evolving, both in terms of our makeup as people that live here in the land economy, and the lack so far of integrated transit planning, I think it's almost certain that we have to head in the direction of that event horizon that Jean-Paul put out there. And I hope, to Pamela's point, that can be something that does create better equity, both in terms of more sustainable places environmentally, better equity in terms of people having access to education and jobs by overcoming the barriers that currently exist in the areas around the airport, which are really diffuse and very hostile to pedestrians and cyclists. So I'm hopeful that this could be a bit of a solution. I think we'll see the same in other airports, particularly about job creation.
So Jean-Paul, maybe I can come to you to sort of help frame the next part of this discussion, which is around in some ways, the politics of these decisions and the governance, which is, can you say more about why it's been so challenging in regions to do coordinated planning around airports? I mean, I thought your slide with the black hole on it was really quite telling, and that airports have been in some ways held outside of regional planning or local planning. And I'm wondering what is the political dynamic there that has held airport planning so separate? Why is that such a common feature, not just here in the Toronto region, but also nationally and globally?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I would say about that is you need to think about the scales of mobility that an airport is putting forward. So it's primarily doing national global connectivity. So we have infrastructure which is designed for long distance travel, and airports are governed and managed with that type of mobility in mind. And then I think Pamela spoke really eloquently about this. There's the challenge of how do you then connect these global networks, this global hub where we fly into, to more localized scales of mobility, whether it's thinking about regional connectivity, linking the airports to Brampton, or getting people on an LRT out to Scarborough, and the more immediate local connectivities. So I think there's a challenge of planning and governing and integrating the different rhythms of mobility which are brought together at airports. So the airports in Canada and North America really kind of developed as national interests. I mean, these are infrastructures of nation building going back to the formation of postal service, right? So the airport has functioned as this kind of broader scale infrastructure, which is attuned to much higher levels and scales of mobility. So on one hand, I think that's one of the challenges where different actors have interests at different scales that become problematic when you bring them together and we think about integrating on a political as well as kind of a planning and infrastructural basis.
Lloyd, maybe I can, go ahead, Jean-Paul.
The second thing would be just to kind of take a jump south of the border, and by juxtaposition, we can look about how a lot of airports in the US are run. So O'Hare in Chicago, Hartsfield-Jackson are run as creatures of the city. Right? These are controlled and operated by the municipality, which is why something like Aerotropolis Atlanta had a lot of issues, because we have this major economic engine generating taxes, jobs, employment that's controlled by the city of Atlanta. And people are on the outside looking in saying, well, we want a piece of this puzzle, we want a piece of this pie. And kind of folding racial questions in the context of Atlanta. One of the things which the city has been strong on is ensuring that the businesses which are run out of Hartsfield-Jackson are majority minority owned. Now, if you throw that into the kind of the racial dynamics of US politics, if you're sitting downstate, this looks like cronyism, and we're depriving a more equitable democratic access to the airports. And a few years ago, there was the state was looking to take over the control of the airport from the city. But is that just going to expose you to a different form of state-based cronyism as opposed to what's happening with the city at the moment? So there's who controls the goodies that an airport provides is another thing which becomes a particularly thorny issue. It's articulated differently in the Canadian context, but if you kind of juxtapose this with what happens down in the US, I think there's another kind of avenue into thinking about this conversation.
So Lloyd, I'll come to you with the question then, because there's another piece of this puzzle, which is who owns the airport. Airports in the Canadian context are one of the few pieces of infrastructure, at least sort of civil infrastructure, that actually have a revenue stream that makes money. And so there is a question around ownership and who controls that, and questions of public ownership and private ownership. And I'm wondering what the experience is like and how it varies between public and private ownership in a context where here in Canada, there have been recent discussions around privatizing airports.
Certainly. Well, certainly when the federal government is responsible for aviation, let's face it, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it was the national priority for Canada to support aviation, and it did that through economic regulation, it did it through having a national flag carrier, it did it through airports and air navigation, supporting all the infrastructure. As time went by, though, and we got into the 80s and 90s, the industry was so vibrant, the political goals had been achieved that the government rethought the wisdom of their continued, the necessity of their continued involvement. I don't want to suggest that the federal government's running of the airport was all bad. There were significant advantages that we enjoyed when it was a national system across the country. For example, the staff was developed across the nation. A young person coming out of school might start in the Arctic with an airport, and then as they gained experience and so on, developed their way up to my job before I retired at Pearson. Similarly, training, you could bring duty managers in from all across the country and make a very professional training, and they could share a network and share their experience. Or for that matter, we have wonderful standards and operating procedures that were, quite frankly, recognized internationally as world class and backed up by functional experts. So there were advantages from the federal government running the airport, but they, I think, paled in comparison to the advantage of moving the airport to the local authorities that we now have, the private sector, and I emphasize that it is private sector, non-shared corporations. And the big advantages that were gained when that happened was the very thing that's been discussed here. You moved the airport decision-making close to the priorities and objectives of the community. So you tie back to something that was very important for the community. I think it can also be recognized that it was tremendously important to get access to private sector resources through the revenue bond market to get the money that we needed to develop the airport, get timely decisions, and get on with it without having to compete with a myriad of other government priorities that were in Canadian government context at a very high level compared to what problems you're trying to solve locally. So I think that was another significant advantage. Quite frankly, listening to the discussion and listening to Jean-Paul talk, of course, another advantage was getting out from under the 4-year political windows that really impacted decision making and trying to have the airport respond to all its stakeholders. You've been talking about government, but remember we got the air carriers here as well, being very interested in all this. But being able to get out from under that, a lot of the airport infrastructure, I was involved in it in updating Pearson from 96 to 2005. It's a decade, and they're long term, and they span over numerous political windows. And with the federal government, it was so hard when you got in the shadow of an election to keep away from those specific interests that Jean-Paul mentioned. So there were really significant advantages. And lastly, I would just say the accountability question. I mean, the current board of Toronto, you have one member each nominated by each of the 5 regions. Now, you mentioned it's not just Peel and Toronto that host the airport, but those other regions that are very much impacted. You have tremendous impact on the surrounding area, the Sudburys, Windsors, Londons. It's the regional airport for Thunder Bay, and so having the 6th board member appointed by the province was really important to recognize this larger impact we're talking about. And finally, 2 board members representing the federal government, because half of the international passengers coming into Canada come through Pearson. So that's a reality. So more than half the board is really appointed by government bodies, and I think that reflects this need for a broader view that you've talked about. I can come back and talk about the whole question of how up until this point the airport planning exercise has been integrated with the surrounding communities, but maybe you want to move on at this point, give someone else a chance to talk.
Thanks, Lloyd. Pamela, the follow-up question from Jean-Paul's discussion and Lloyd's comment too for me is really around the local planning aspect. And the trajectory in sort of city planning, especially post-pandemic, has really been around a reimagination of the local, right? Like the idea of the 15-minute city, which is building everything that's close by, walkable, cyclable, building neighborhoods that people can live, work, and play within close proximity. And if we think, the airport model, the Airtropolis as it's been envisioned previously, was very much at a different scale. It seemed like it was at the opposite. It was at a giant scale. Everything was supersized, I guess you could say, and much of it was freight based. And I'm wondering is there a way that the model of building around, or put it differently, is the city building around airports compatible with this relocalization based on the types of flows that you described earlier? Or are we talking about two completely incompatible models of growth and development?
Well, it's almost two extremes, the Aerotropolis on one side and the 15-minute city on the other. And actually,
That's right.
I don't think either of those are particularly viable. The 15-minute city, it's viable to a point, but obviously there's only a certain amount of employment that's going to be able to be integrated into an area with residential. You know, a lot of employment is still going to need to concentrate with other employment to get those agglomeration economies, you know, to get innovation happening. It's not really going to be possible. And I guess there's an added layer in terms of the airport, which is you can't really have residential there because of the noise. And you can't really have a lot of density either because of noise and the height restrictions and restrictions on residential. But having said that, I think there is a huge opportunity in the airport, because when you look, and the airport area, when you look at what's actually there, it's kind of like you have all the ingredients of a beautiful salad, but you know, they're all like in separate bowls on the countertop. And if you mix them together and in this case also densify, then I think there could be a huge improvement in that area itself. So again, there is a limitation that you can't really add residential, but there's a huge opportunity for improving the environment, you know, both in terms of densification. One study that I did, I just looked at how much you might be able to densify the airport corporate center, which is a small portion of the area around. And given the most conservative estimates, you could easily add 35,000 jobs there. Just building on parking lots, basically, and not even big buildings. And I think what has to really happen that's not happening is looking at the transit investment opportunity in conjunction with the land use planning, so that we can reimagine the area at the same time as we're planning transit. How do we reurbanize this area? How do we get more amenity? How do we improve the public realm? How do we densify? And how do we make this actually a better place where if we densify, then we can get better level of transit service? And I think part of the problem right now is because of the fragmentation amongst responsibilities and just the general siloization and fragmentation between municipalities, that this isn't really happening. And it's a huge opportunity, again, given the importance of this area, not only regionally, but nationally. And I think there's a huge opportunity there that's not really being taken up.
So Josh, maybe I'll come to you. And I know you've worked and engaged with the hub, GTA West hub. And I'm wondering, can a hub of that nature spur the type of, at least, if not a 15-minute neighborhood, at least a place that's walkable and has the types of amenities that can create a place for a people place rather than a truck thoroughfare, and a place that really doesn't have that amenity? Or is an airport always going to be a place to go, like a through space, rather than a space that you really want to come and settle? Not just the airport itself, but the spaces around the transit. I mean, transit is a catalyst. Transit is often seen as a catalyst for other types of development. Can that actually happen around something like the GTA West hub?
Yeah, in this case, just to start, the transit is actually something that's overdue, right? We already have a major trip generator, a tremendous trip generator with a just ghastly mode splits in terms of automobile use. And the surrounding structure is going to determine the walkability or the sense of place, or you want to call it 15-minute city potential, just as much as the airport will, if not more. I'm very deeply skeptical of 15-minute city planning for the region generally. You look at, there's some great maps from Mississauga, for instance, where they map who works in Mississauga and where they live, and then they do the inverse. And you just see that every morning our region wakes up and just completely scrambles, and before COVID anyhow, right? It's just that is the real nature of our city. So I do like to kind of imagine planning systems that reflect the reality of the region we're in. And I don't think a 15-minute city, especially in the airport, is one that we're really striving for. But I do think on the airport side of things, there's absolutely the potential to improve that edge, to catalyze something bigger, to bring networked connectivity over time. I mean, this is several decades of investment in connecting the lines, and Pamela went through what those connections might be, and that's all being worked out. But certainly the airport has land that could be put to better use, and definitely not for residential, but for the scale of office and high quality office and kind of office campus space you're seeing at other airport cities could absolutely take place there, and would be a vast improvement over the current condition. You could certainly imagine Airport Road transforming on both sides. It falls apart a bit after that. The airport structure, the airport area structure with the 300,000 jobs is massive and diffuse, and is as much responding to the airport and its height limits and its access to the airport as it is our highway infrastructure and our policies that really protect that kind of employment space. And that employment space is incredibly valuable right now. It's a 1% vacancy in the GTA for that kind of industrial land. So that's a very rigid structure for an urban area. So I don't think we're going to see a complete transformation. I think we would see potentially, if let's say Union Station West was realized, we would see a massive benefit for the region in terms of broader connectivity away from the local scale. The local scale improvement might be something much more modest, which would be, some kind of new office, high value office area directly related to people that want to be linked to an airport, and a real improvement of the quality of place, and maybe some local connectivity for employees. But that's a tough one to crack. That the last mile is a real challenge here, right? We know we need it. We know we have people that are basically forced to drive cars to jobs in the airport employment zone because there's no other option. And it's something we all need to crack. And I think people are hoping that if you have at least that catalytic hub west of Toronto, that might be a jump off point for that.
And Jean-Paul, maybe I'll bring you back in to, again, prompt us around your third point around the ecological limits. Pre-pandemic, air travel was very much in the sights of people who were activists and others talking about climate change. Many of the ground solutions were focusing on, adding better transit. Those will have perhaps some impact if we get cars off the road driving to the airport. But for many of the activist community, they're saying that the problem is really in all the air travel. Have you seen, what do you envision in terms of the types of changes? Do you think we've reached the ecological limit? Do you think we've reached a political moment around air travel? How are you envisioning that tension with the ecological dimension, as well as in evolving technologies? And maybe, there might be a technology fix out there. I wonder how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't think we may have reached certain ecological limits, but we haven't in a political sense, with enough kind of backing behind it, which is going to lead to significant change. I think one of the interesting things here that I was thinking when I was listening to Lloyd's initial comments is there's an impact on passenger transport, but while we're all stuck at home, what are we doing? We're fueling e-commerce, right? So we're saying, well, we aren't going to go somewhere. Our bodies are going to remain in a house, but bring the stuff to us, right? And that's got to get there, get here somehow. So there's a certain level of luxury that we're enjoying that's, black box, it's behind the scenes. We're not kind of thinking about the full consequences here. And I think there are some parallels with like electric vehicles. Well, you still need to have a whole bunch of rare minerals, all this stuff going into like producing cars. It's not going to wean us off fossil fuel dependency if we're still thinking about how these things are produced. So I think there's kind of knock-on effects that even if we are starting to have some of these conversations around, maybe we should curtail business travel, maybe in the context of academia, maybe our national conferences might be better off being held online and we're not going to travel to different places to give talks. Those are individual decisions, but there's underlying structural issues, which I still think we need to grapple with to start to actually face up to the size and the magnitude of what these ecological limits are going to be and the impact that that's going to have on everyday life. It's going to be inconvenient beyond the impacts on face-to-face business networking, or like I'm sure we're all itching to get on a plane and go somewhere sunny And I'm looking forward to getting out of Atlanta and going somewhere else. But the things which enable pandemic life to happen, right? These are things which are going to be significant. So even though people aren't flying, I think that the World Economic Forum was projecting a 36% rise in passenger flights shifting to cargo usage. So planes are still going to be going around in ways that are less immediate to us, but these are things which you still need to think about grappling with in kind of very real political and material ways.
Yeah. Lloyd, maybe I can come to you, and I'm going to start for our audience. I'm going to start weaving in audience questions. There are a few in the Q&A. If you have questions, please, you can add them now, and I'll start putting them to our panelists. Lloyd, maybe I'll come to you with a question from Nick Lombardo, which builds on Jean-Paul's response there, which is again around this matter of climate change and airport management and how airports are responding. And I'm wondering, from your experience running the largest airport in this country, to what extent are folks who are managing these major assets discussing climate change and shifts in airport air travel, and how are they thinking about potential for policy that leads to actually a shrinking of air travel rather than a growth?
No question, it's top of mind. I mean, air travel constitutes about 3% of the greenhouse emissions, and so it's not a significant amount at all. And there's great concern about that. Unfortunately, the reality at this present moment is that due to the energy density of fossil fuels, they're ideal for air travel because of the weight consideration that's paramount in air travel. So, I mean, work is going on at hydrogen, but there's certainly no evident breakthrough that's likely to change that. So we are rather stuck with a situation that the technology the way it is for the moment, and so have to work within that. I think there's a lot of thought being given to it, though. I mean, at the airport level, what can be done? Particularly, you're getting ideas such as, of course, eliminating all highly polluting things like what they call APUs, auxiliary power units, or jet engines essentially on the ground that are terrible pollutants. Getting rid of those for more efficient ways of servicing the aircraft when on the ground, towing the aircraft, the electric tugs to the end of the runway. There are all kinds of different ways, particularly metering aircraft out so you don't get queuing and delays and congestion because it's an aircraft sitting there idling that's the worst offender. And all of these things are being actively considered. But again, I come back to that energy density question. The whole success of aviation is predicated on the fact that it defeats geography. It goes over mountain ranges that frustrate highways or railways. It goes over oceans, frustrate 5-day steamship trips. So that aspect of it is unique and what has made this such a vibrant industry. Certainly, I think as governments struggle with meeting their goals, they have to prioritize. Obviously, links between Toronto and Montreal can be dealt with high-speed trains or other means. You don't have to rely on aviation. Perhaps that will be a direction that government wants to go in. But the reality is that to enjoy the world that we have, to bring the world to Toronto, to enjoy the experience that Toronto has to offer, and to take Torontonians to the rest of the world means air travel.
Thank you. And I'll now come to a question from James Janowski. And James's question is that in other jurisdictions that have transit systems with airport connections, the question is, does the ridership generated by the airport cross-subsidize the rest of the network? So it's, in many ways, it's a question about how, if one is to build closer and better airport rail connections, how high is the ridership? Are these a net revenue generator, or are these financial? Do these require ongoing subsidies? And just before our panel answers, we could say a lot about the Union Pearson Express and what it's doing financially to the Toronto regional transit system, but maybe I'll put it to our panel, to our panelists to speak about their experience with transit, airport transit systems. Josh and Pamela, I'll go. Josh, do you want to go first?
Sure, and I can't answer the question with any certainty. I would say that I don't think there's really any scenarios, frankly, in our immediate region where there's a net benefit of a transit line. I do think, again, we're addressing a problem that already exists, which is a really a mode split that's way out of whack. And the benefit of putting transit at the airport is that you already have a major established trip generator, where if you were to otherwise imagine where you would put transit investment in that northwest part of the immediate part of the GTA Mississauga kind of area, with absent the airport, the numbers probably wouldn't work at all, right? That's the real benefit of leveraging the airport here, is you have an existing trip generator. I don't think it's going to subsidize investments along the way. I certainly think that there's probably numbers being crunched as we speak about what the forecast would be for ridership, but I don't imagine that's going to be paying for much else. I do think potentially, and I don't know what arrangements are being made, that it's in the airport's interest to have transit infrastructure there for its own long-term viability. So it could be that the partnership between an airport and the transit systems around it will be beneficial to those transit systems in terms of being able to extend to that specific place. But I don't think it's subsidizing anything beyond that immediate local area, but that's a hunch.
Pamela, maybe I can sort of redirect that question a little bit then, is how do we build transit systems that include airports that are not just for business travelers, but are also for a wider audience, including especially workers, many of whom are working in low wage work? How do we ensure that if we are investing heavily in public transits, that it has a broad impact and is available to a broad audience?
Well, I think the answer to that is you have to start by thinking of the whole area that you're trying to serve, and to look for what are the best ways to get, again, I think the number one priority is how do you get workers to jobs? And those 250,000 workers who work around the airport, who almost all have to get to work by car, that's what you have to address. And so what is the best way to do that? I don't know the answer to that question, but I don't know that the proposal that we have in front of us for Union Station West is the answer to that, because that starts with the idea that you have a hub, and that then you need a last mile solution for the other 250,000 workers who work around. So I think there's probably another solution. I don't know what it is. Maybe you have a loop. Maybe you have, LRT going up Dixie, so you have a north-south connection to bring people from the south. I think the problem is we haven't asked the question. I think that's the major problem. We've gone to a fixed solution before we've asked the question. And I think part of that gets to another theme of John Paul's, which is about fragmentation and the black hole and who's driving, projects. And in this case, because of the fragmentation of the airport area amongst municipalities and the GTAA and Metrolinx, GTAA has basically stepped in and they're taking the lead role. So we don't have a way of kind of like making sure that there's a broader solution that actually serves the broader community, not only right around the airport, but the whole Western GTA. So we need the governance solutions as well.
Yeah, I think that's important. And just for the record, apparently in the most recent year that data is available, the Union Pearson Express, each trip is being subsidized by $11. And that's quite a bit more significant than the Toronto Transit Commission and other systems in the region. So just to set that part of the record, that the likelihood that transit to the airport will be will be a money generator is unlikely. But that doesn't mean that providing effective transit, especially for workers, is not significant. I mean, the airport's a major workplace.
And what was very interesting about that is it started out as a connection just to get passengers to the airport for business travel and other international travelers, get them from the airport to downtown. And that was not sustainable. So again, they started out with the global competitive cities model. And then it turned into, well, that's not actually working. So now it's been reworked into something about how can we actually use that piece of infrastructure, which we now have, to get people to their jobs.
So I think that's an important theme. And I know we're in the last 5 minutes. Maybe this is somewhere to start wrapping up. Lloyd, I'll come to you first. Can an airport be something, an airport as significant and large as Pearson Airport, can it be something that's both global and local? Like, can it have this be in many ways, the global entrance point into Canada, but also something that is a locally meaningful touch point? Or by the nature of its giantism, right? The airport is just a huge piece of land with huge infrastructure. Everything is built so big. Does it by its very nature overpower everything local around it?
I don't think so. I think it very much can be play all, not only the local, regional, and continental and international role. Very much so. I'd like to touch on one point from Pamela, though, because I couldn't agree more with what she said. One of the challenges of having run the airport, of course, is the question of timing, Pamela. We were back in, I guess, would be 97, maybe, or even earlier, I suppose, even 1992 or so on, looking at having to do something about the airport because we were running out of capacity. It was growing 1 million passengers a year, and we were really in dire need of having to do something. Metrolinx was just coming on stream then. I mean, it was just getting cranked up at that point and starting to develop their plan. And we really, of course, couldn't wait. We couldn't wait until all these things get coordinated. So one thing that was done, and it turned out, I think it's turned out well, is though trying to make the airport as flexible as possible to meet whatever future arrives at our door, given the vicissitudes of future developments that could exist over a wide range. So what was done was, for example, with cooperation of the federal government at the national level, all the infrastructure, all the pylons and the basic station was laid in for the upline long before that was ever approved or developed. Similarly, if you look at the intra-airport train that connects the terminals and then goes out to the remote parking and the hotel complexes out there, it's on look at it next time, it's on enormous vents, way more than that light train requires. Why? Because again, not being certain of what was going to happen, we wanted to make sure that a heavier technology could be put in to connect to the GO that Pamela mentioned. And in the $1.5 billion terminal itself, the base floor there is a massive ground transportation complex built to handle all buses and fed in from all around the region. So trying to be as flexible as possible so you can pivot in any direction. That's expensive. We were very fortunate to get support from our board about that because they can see the importance of it. Very, very fortunate. But sometimes that's the reality of this whole planning exercise. You try to do it all in concert, but something's getting out of it.
So we're now in our last minute here, Jean-Paul, and I want to give you the last word. What lessons should we take from the pandemic? You gave us a great overview. I'm going to give you 1 minute to sort of wrap up and let us know what when we think about airports and we think about this moment, what are the lessons from the pandemic?
I want to say the pandemic, represents a crisis. I mean, this is something which, Matty, you could have framed the conversation around. And crises are hard, right? This, the last year that we've kind of lived through has been difficult. But what crises enable us to do is to think about things differently. They broaden the parameters of the conversations that we can have, and the discussions and the types of things which we can talk about regarding airports and more things kind of beyond that in the context of pandemic and post-pandemic city. So I think there are really kind of interesting things to think through around the impact of e-commerce. I know a lot of the conversation here today has been focused on Pearson, but with a shift towards freight cargo, there's another conversation that we can have around Hamilton Airport, for example. And one of the things which I unfortunately had to skip through in the slides was thinking about regional collaboration and specialization in airport industries. So I think e-commerce is going to be an interesting thing to kind of think through moving forward. The future of work and how it connects to transport and travel is going to be another really important trajectory to consider. And I guess as a conclusion, I think we need to address and embrace this moment of crisis as a window to really ask some serious questions about the nature of the development that we want to have, both in terms of these airports being these large major pieces of global infrastructure. And I like your question to Lloyd because airports are always global and local. Right? They are local as they exist at the moment, just not necessarily in the ways we would ideally like them to be. So the lessons from the pandemic will hopefully be, we have a lot of things to consider and a lot of things on our table, but ideally the ultimate lesson will be the opportunity to think broad, to think big, and to really kind of grapple with some of these large scale structural questions that we need to get our hands on moving forward.
Thanks, Jean-Paul. That's a really provocative, thoughtful place for us to end. I want to thank Jean-Paul, Lloyd, Pamela, Josh, for a really stimulating discussion today. And Enid, I'll turn it back over to you to say some final concluding remarks. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Maddie. We started the discussion by saying this was going to be a very different event than it would have been last year before the pandemic. And we ended up by talking about the pandemic. But actually, during the course of the hour and a half, we talked about a lot of other things. And I agree with Jean-Paul. What a pandemic does is makes you stand back and think about what needs to change, and whether it's the development or, we've talked about competitiveness, job creation, quality of life, affordable housing. We talked about transit. We talked about climate change. All of these things were things we have to think about anyway, and the pandemic really just highlights some of the cracks in the system. This has been a very rich discussion with really the best group of experts we could have found. So I'd like to thank Jean-Paul, Josh, Pamela, and Lloyd, and Maddie for handling this whole conversation. It's been a great discussion. Today's event has been recorded and will be available on our website in the next few days, so feel free to share it with colleagues who couldn't attend today. And I will just finish by saying thank you so much for coming today. Have a good evening.